December 7th, 1941, the day America was dragged into one of the largest world conflicts in history.
They had aerial photographs taken from sightseeing tours. They had the schedules of folks as they would go in and show up to work, and they had the sum of the home addresses of folks who worked and did important things. And loose lips sink ships. You have to be very, very careful about what you talk about.
This led the Japanese to know exactly what to attack. Even with this knowledge, the Japanese needed to train to and prepare for absolute victory. It took about a year for Japanese Admiral Yamamoto to plan the attack.
On December 7th, 1941, Japan, like its infamous Axis partners, struck first and declared war afterwards. Costly to our Navy was the loss of war vessels, airplanes, and equipment. But more costly to Japan was the effectiveness of its foul attack in immediately unifying America in its determination to fight and win the war thrust upon it.
The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was conducted in two waves of planes. The first wave of Japanese planes was to gain air superiority and cause as much damage as possible before the Americans realized what was happening and were able to organize a defense. The second wave was to inflict as much damage as possible to the fleet and other military installations. The surprise attack on Pearl Harbor was devastating to the American Pacific Front. The United States didn't even know that they were coming. On the radar they saw multiple planes, but there were supposed to be many B-17s coming that day as well. This gave the Japanese a great advantage over the defenseless fleet. The amount of damage they caused was devastating. The United States Pacific Fleet had been reduced to a few damaged boats, and Roosevelt wanted a win to show Japan that they were not invincible. After Congress almost unanimously declared war on the Empire of Japan following President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's famous Day of Infamy speech,
yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
America was ready to fight, but not sure what to do. The psychological impact Pearl Harbor had on the United States left the public very unhappy, so the president gathered some of his advisors together to devise a strategy for retaliation against the Japanese Empire. Only 2 weeks after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, on December 21st of 1941, Roosevelt demanded that we bomb the Japanese mainland, a task that seemed impossible and too great of a risk. That's where Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle came in, and the Doolittle Raid began. The year is 1942, and the war in the Pacific has been heavily favorable towards the Japanese Empire. The United States faces an enemy that they are not prepared to fight, with only some carriers and a crippled battleship fleet. The Japanese Empire has won victory after victory, including Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, and other Pacific islands. President Franklin Roosevelt has demanded for the bombing of the Japanese mainland and has assigned the impossible task to a man who has faced the impossible many times. James, or Jimmy, H. Doolittle was a man who was not intimidated by the impossible. One of the well-known stories of Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle was when he flew a Curtiss P-1 plane without being able to use the pedals. He was also the first pilot to ever execute a maneuver known as the outside loop, previously thought to be a fatal move. He won many aviation medals, including the Schneider Trophy in 1925 for racing a Curtiss Navy seaplane, the fastest it had been flown up to that time, averaging around 232 miles per hour. If anyone could complete the impossible task of bombing the Japanese mainland, it would be Doolittle. Doolittle's plan for the attack would be to sneak bombers into the Japanese waters and launch the bombers from an aircraft carrier. The bombers would then drop their payload over Tokyo. The bombers would not have enough fuel to fly back to the task force after bombing Tokyo, so they would be forced to land in Japanese-occupied China. However, many obstacles would alter the plan from exactly what Doolittle wanted. The first part of the Doolittle Raid was the training. Doolittle had a volunteer corps of around 80 pilot, navigators, engineers, bombardiers, and gunners, all of whom were told of the dangers of what they were about to do. Doolittle instructed his crews, "Look to your left, look to your right. One of you will not come home." He would be in charge of training these men into combat-ready, efficient air crews. The training would start on February 19th, 1942. The aircraft chosen for this mission was B-25 Mitchell-class medium bomber. One of the problems with the B-25 was that it did not have a large enough fuel capacity to launch from a safe distance from Japan and still reach its destination, much less China.
After we got in the airplane to fly it, I liked the way it flew, and I liked the way it had some engines that would take you through the air at about 260 miles an hour.
Doolittle instructed to take off anything that was not needed for the mission. They then doubled the fuel capacity of the plane by adding more fuel cells. Doolittle's B-25 went from having 646 gallons of fuel to being able to carry 1,141 gallons of fuel. The plane would now have enough fuel to fly the 450 miles it would need to reach Japan and China. On April 1st, 1942, the Doolittle Raiders, along with the maintenance crew for the B-25s, boarded the USS Hornet. Hornet was only able to carry 16 B-25s on the raid and still have enough runway for the plane to take off. Before the B-25s were loaded onto the Hornet, they were equipped with 500-pound bombs and were stripped of nearly all other equipment. This would allow for more bombs and more fuel. The Hornet would be escorted by a carrier called the USS Enterprise, 8 destroyers, 4 cruisers, and 2 ship oilers. The B-25s were modified even more on board the Hornet. The B-25s, if able to take off the deck, would now surely be able to fly the 450 miles to reach China.
But bad luck intervenes.
We ran across this little, what we thought was a fishing boat. Turned out to be a patrol boat. We didn't pick it up on our surface radar, it was that small. Cruiser Nashville went out with her 6-inch battery and sank this thing. And we thought, well, maybe we got away with it. But Radio Pearl Harbor actually intercepted a message reporting warships.
So they had to launch, and they had to launch right then and there. There was no turning back.
The carriers are 650 miles from the Japanese mainland. It means Doolittle and his men might not have the fuel to make it out safely. They choose to go anyway. At 8:20 a.m., on the cold, damp, and blustery morning of April 18th, 1942, the B-25 Mitchell bombers prepare for takeoff.
Around 6 hours later, the Doolittle Raiders started dropping their bombs over industrial targets that had been marked. There was only very light anti-aircraft fire and few enemy fighters that were protecting Japan's skies. The results of the raid were 3 killed in action, 1 in China and 2 off the coast of China, 8 prisoners of war, 3 executed, 1 died in captivity, and 4 repatriated. 7 crew members received injuries serious enough to require medical treatment. With the loss of 15 aircraft, amazingly, only 3 were killed in action. The people that helped the Americans once they landed in China paid dearly for their actions. Some of the men who crashed were aided by the Irish Bishop of Nanchang, Patrick Cleary. The Japanese retaliated by burning down cities in China. They did this because the Chinese aided the raiders and they wanted to find and capture them. So the Japanese went through China burning down towns, cities, and anywhere that might have aided the Doolittle Raiders. Nearly 250,000 Chinese people were executed in this campaign. This campaign was called the Zhejiang-Jiangxi campaign. Overall, this raid had accomplished a lot mentally for America. We had finally gotten a win. A result of that win was a great morale boost for America. It was a large turning point for the United States. It showed that Japan was not as invulnerable as they thought. The Doolittle Raid accomplished a lot for the American war effort. Although it did not do much physical damage, it helped increase American morale. It also served as a precursor to much larger American triumphs, such as Midway, Saipan, and Iwo Jima. Ultimately, it led to an American victory in the Pacific Theater.